Lama El Baz, and I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Maryland and an associate at the Institute for Gulf Affairs. I am so honored and very excited to be moderating our conversation today. So to get us started, I'd like to just briefly introduce our panelists. We are pleased to be joined today by Dr. Shireen Al-Adeimi, a Yemeni-American assistant professor of education at Michigan State University, Dr. Annelle, Sheline, a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Shuaib Al-Mosawa, a Yemeni journalist based in Sana'a, Yemen, and Ali Al-Ahmed, the founder and director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. So our panel consists of journalists, activists, and scholars from Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, all here today to discuss their different perspectives on the UN-brokered two-month truce in Yemen, the formation of the Presidential Leadership Council, and the possibility of peace between the warring parties and an end to the humanitarian crisis that has plagued the Yemeni people for far too long. To our speakers, and especially Dr. Shireen and Shuaib, thank you so much for joining us today and representing Yemeni voices. As an organization, we are committed to disseminating credible information from sources that are representative of the countries and issues that we work on. So we are very grateful for your time today and for helping us maintain that commitment. With that being said, let's jump right in. Dr. Shireen, do you mind briefly introducing yourself and then summarizing, for those who aren't familiar, the war in Yemen, the truce that was recently brokered, the development of the Presidential Leadership Council, and what this all means for the future of Yemen? Kind of give us some context here.
Sure. Thanks so much, Lama, for hosting, and I look forward to engaging with others on the panel as well as the audience. So thank you all for being here. The war in Yemen, I mean, the roots really could go back to 2011 with the start of the Arab Spring, but it essentially led to a power struggle that led with the Houthi takeover of Sana'a in late 2014. And then the milestone that has been most detrimental to Yemenis was in March of 2015, when the Saudi-led coalition began bombing Yemen under the guise of reinstating President Hadi to power. He is the UN-recognized president, or was the UN-recognized president of Yemen, but he was in this interim role. So they were trying to reinstate him and take power away from the Houthis. The Houthis formed coalition and began fighting back. And so it led to where we are today, with Yemen being the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Estimates of at least 377,000 people who have been who've died as a result of the conflict, either through direct warfare or through starvation, mainly through the blockade. The blockade has caused the death of a child every 75 seconds. So nowhere on earth is a humanitarian crisis that is man-made so intense and exhaustive. And so the blockade involves a fuel blockade, a land blockade, an air blockade, where all airports in the northern part of Yemen that the Houthis controlled are they're not able to operate, and then all the ships coming into Yemen, whether they're fuel or for food or aid, they get inspected by the Saudis and many times get rerouted back to Saudi Arabia, even though the UN has set up a monitoring system that is supposed to, verify that these are in fact fuel or aid ships. On the ground, over the last 7 years, not much has changed. There have been key battlefronts in the northern part of Yemen in Ma'rib, and in the southwest in Taiz, but mostly the Houthis control about, the former North Yemen, where about 70-80% of the population reside, and then the Hadi coalition, as well as separatists, control the southern part. Fast forward to this past year, where Houthis began to, I wouldn't say began, but they maybe intensified their strikes against the UAE and Saudi Arabia, because for the longest time, this was a unilateral war, really. It's not even technically a war, considering the onslaught that Yemenis have endured compared to the Saudis or the Emirati civilians, whose, civilian deaths count in the scores and not in the hundreds of thousands like we see in Yemen. But the Houthis were able to attack certain key areas in Saudi Arabia, including Aramco, so oil facilities. And it essentially led to, real negotiations for the first time in a while. Negotiations have happened before, but they were held in Oman. And Oman, I should say, is a neutral party in this war, unlike many or all of Yemen's neighbors, really, in the Gulf, in the peninsula. And the negotiations led to the Saudis essentially agreeing to certain terms that the Houthis proposed, including the removal of certain people within the council, so Ali Mohsen, for example. But then it kind of led to this very late night reshuffle and appointment essentially of a presidential council, and President Hadi stepping down. And he's been based in Saudi Arabia this entire time. And so he's now stepped down, which puts into question this legitimacy that the Saudis have been using to bombard, occupy, starve Yemen for the past 7 years. And it was replaced by this presidential council. And what's important to note that almost every single person in the council is a war man. You know, it's essentially a war council. You have people who are separatists who have fought the Houthis on the ground. You have people who have fought them in Ma'rib, and Shabwa, and Hadeda, and Taiz. And so there are multiple people on there, but I don't even think they agree with one another. They have much in common with one another, let alone with the Houthis. And so for me, it signals that perhaps the Saudis are trying to save face, and you know they have been for a while. I mean, how could they have essentially lost this war to the Houthis? And this is a bit of an exit strategy, but it also disadvantages Yemen and Yemenis because it's this veneer of transition of power to Yemeni leaders. But I worry that what it would essentially mean is more war, but with more foreign intervention, really, but with Yemeni faces as they're at the front. So that's kind of like the very quick overall summary. I'm sure we'll get into details with the other panelists as well as in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Shireen. Shuaib, moving on to you. Can you briefly introduce yourself a little bit and some of the work you've done, and then describe how you and other Yemenis feel about the truce? Are you optimistic that it will hold? What does this mean for Yemenis moving forward? Shuaib, are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, I guess not. So we could just move forward. Dr. Annelle, would you like to briefly introduce yourself and then speak a little bit about American foreign policy in Yemen and what that might look like moving forward?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lama, and to the Gulf Institute for hosting this discussion. To my fellow panelists, I hope Shuaib is able to join us. So to briefly get into sort of the U.S. role here, essentially back in 2015, when the Saudi-led coalition first intervened, we saw the Obama administration decide to support that effort. And this was partly based on a calculus or the hope that Saudi Arabia would pull its punches in terms of the Iran nuclear deal, which was being negotiated at the time. And also Mohammed bin Salman, who at the time was defense minister and not yet crown prince, assured the Obama administration that the war would be over very quickly, would take a matter of weeks. And unfortunately, neither of those things panned out. The Saudis have been and were quite critical of the Iran nuclear deal, and obviously the war is now in its 8th year. So unfortunately, we have seen U.S. support continue throughout that time. We saw President Trump escalate support. The Obama administration had imposed a few limitations on certain types of weapons to try to limit civilian deaths, and we saw Trump lift those, for example. Then when the Biden administration came in, he really made a lot of us focusing on Yemen and from Yemen feel optimistic that perhaps finally the U.S. was going to end its support for what Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other countries have been doing to Yemen. In his first foreign policy speech in February of 2021, he said that the U.S. was going to end all support for offensive military actions, including relevant arms sales. Unfortunately, in the intervening year, it became clear that the administration was not interested in defining what exactly that meant, offensive versus defensive. We did see $1 billion in new arms sales go through, although the administration would maintain that they have limited some of what has been sold, for example, air-to-ground munitions. But in general, if you look, for example, I had a report come out recently from the Quincy Institute, which used data from the Yemen Data Project, which tracks the air raids of the Saudi-led coalition. And we would have expected to see those air raids decline from the Trump era to the Biden era because he had said that he was going to end all US support for offensive actions. But what instead we saw was that the levels of air raids remained relatively consistent from the Trump era to the Biden era. And then unfortunately, at the end of last year and into this year, we saw a sharp increase in air raids. Now, under the terms of the Truce, the Yemen Data Project has reported the first week of no air raids. And I say that with some hesitation because there have been reports. I mean, both sides have said that the other side is violating the truce. But according to the Yemen Data Project, they at least have not documented air raids for this past week. Which is encouraging and again sort of speaks to the hope that Saudi Arabia, as Dr. Al-Adeimi mentioned, that finally both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are dealing with the costs of what their aggression against Yemen is doing. And that, as we saw, it only took that one successful drone strike on Abu Dhabi and the recent attack on the Aramco facility near Jeddah to really help convince the Saudi and Emirati leadership that maybe it's not worth it for them to continue to wage this horrific war on Yemen because it does undermine their image as these bastions of stability and a magnet for tourists. And we know MBS is working very hard to attract international investment. And so I do think that the fact that the Houthis are able to impose greater costs on the foreign belligerents is having an impact here. And also I think that the fact that we saw members of Congress commit to reintroducing a war powers resolution to end US support. Clearly the Biden administration has not ended support. It's up to Congress now. We saw a war powers resolution pass successfully in spring of 2019, but then Trump vetoed it. And the hope is that if there's enough support, if Americans pay attention, that there would be enough support in Congress to get this passed, and that it would look pretty bad if Biden were to veto it, given that he did say he was going to end support here. But I do worry that as we're probably all aware, the war in Yemen just doesn't tend to get a whole lot of attention. And so many Americans just aren't really aware of it, or if they are, they don't have an awareness of the extent to which the US is very much complicit in what is happening, and that they themselves could have an impact in asking their member of Congress to support the war powers resolution, that could have a big effect. So I'll stop there for now, but happy to flesh out more about the U.S. role if that would be helpful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Annelle. Yeah, I think we'll get into that later in our Q&A portion, but I think we're going to talk a lot about the war powers resolution and things like that. So last but not least, before we head into the Q&A portion, Ali, do you mind describing the role that Saudi Arabia has played in the conflict?
Let's get Shuaib. Sorry.
Yes.
Shuaib, good to hear from you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. It's all good. Do you mind introducing yourself and some of the work that you've done, and then describe how you and other Yemenis feel about the truce? Are you optimistic that it will hold? And what do you feel like this means for Yemenis moving forward?
Yeah, first, my name is Shuaib. Shuaib, Lasto Shuaib. I'm not Shuaib, I'm Shuaib.
Shuaib.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for the clarification.
yeah, it's a little bit confusing to others. On the optimism side of the truce, yes, we feel, me and a lot of Yemeni people feel optimistic about what's been achieved so far. It's the first since the war began in 2015, and it's the first we have seen the first days with no airstrikes, as other panelists pointed out. But it remains difficult for a lot of people to see the good part of the truce. They're not. A lot of people do not have enough to provide for themselves and their families. But a step by step, hopefully, will lead to some a breakthrough in the 7-year war. And but although a lot of people are optimistic, some are a little bit skeptic because they think it's just this is a break for everyone to prepare their fighters and then fire again. And I share some of those skepticism, and I hope we don't go again to the fighting cycle again.
Inshallah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ali, do you mind describing the role that Saudi Arabia has played in the conflict and kind of what the Saudi reaction has been to the truce and the formation of the Leadership Council?
I think, thank you very much, Ms. Lama. Thank you, everybody. The establishment of the Presidential Council was definitely an imposed decision. It was not Hadi's own thinking and not his former Vice President Ali Muhsin Al-Ahmar's own decision. This was it's like a show that they brought hundreds of Yemeni expatriates that basically agree with the Saudi and Emirati view in Yemen, and they imposed the decision to create this council. I think the problem here is they are continuing the same approach to Yemen. In 2014, they almost imposed this, what they call the GCC initiative, which was supported then by the United States and by the United Nations. And it got us into this mess. Now, this sort of thinking, the line of thinking continues. So we are having another sort of creation. That's not Yemeni, at least not 100% Yemeni. And I think it will lead to greater problems. Unless, of course, this was agreed upon also by the other side, the people in Sana'a, the rival. So if everybody had made that sort of arrangement, things will move in the right direction, I think. But if it was not, and it was just meant to create, like Dr. Al-Adeimi said, a war council, then Yemen is looking at, also, and continuing of conflict and loss of life in that country. Saudi Arabia definitely wants to get out of this mess. Maybe this is one of the way for them to create a council and push them to move from Riyadh, because Hadi has spent the past 7+ years in Riyadh. So his legitimacy, although it's been supported by the US and the UN and the Saudis and the Emiratis, it has not been very popular. So I'm not sure what will happen, but the fact that there are no bombs being dropped, that's great. I think it's the best decision that the Saudi government has made since March of 2015, because they have not won anything. The Yemenis lost, obviously, the majority, and this whole thing could have been averted by negotiation and by reaching a political settlement before, with the caveat that any approach to Yemen must take Yemeni input. it is the famous Yemeni slogan لن ترى في الدنيا على أرض وصية. You will not see anybody impose his will on Yemen. That's the famous Yemeni thing. It's very independent sort of thinking in Yemen. So it has to go with that. It has to be a Yemeni decision, 100%. People, the United States, the UK, the Saudis, we could support, but to interfere and to impose that thing is not, it's not going to end. In the region in general, not only in Yemen, but generally across the region, you see people desire and pushing to participate in any decision that affects their lives, but specifically the political, the formation of political systems and regimes in their countries. I'm hoping that the Saudi government will see that it is in their own interest that if they allow and let Yemen decide its own fate and future, rather than sort of continuing this policy that goes from, it has started since 1963, where the Saudi, were opposed to the formation of the Republic of Yemen, and has since continued to interfere in Yemen, including their role in toppling Ibrahim al-Hamdi, the most popular Yemeni president. So having said that, I want to close by saying that it's important that not only the Saudis and other regional powers understand this is a Yemeni issue, and only Yemenis can come up with a solution that fits them. And we have to accept the reality of Yemen. If there are people who think certain ways, they are part of that state, and we have to involve them in the process, not to pretend they don't exist and ignore their influence and their role and their existence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali, and to our other panelists for sharing some of your insight and giving the audience some context on our conversation today. So now that we have some context, let's get into our first question. I guess kind of my first reaction when listening to the news about the truce being brokered is kind of like, there have been a lot of prior ceasefire attempts enacted to reach a diplomatic resolution, but on those occasions, the ceasefires were largely ignored, rejected, and they broke down. So what makes this truce any different? At this point, what is motivating or incentivizing the parties to abide by the ceasefire? Can anyone take this question?
Shuaib, are you going for it?
Yeah, start. I'll be next.
Okay.
Start.
I would say the fact that it was mentioned already, but the Houthi strikes on Aramco in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, I think that was a game changer. And if the Saudis know now that, and the Jeddah attack, by the way, happened, as Formula One was happening and they were seeing this. And so it kind of shook this idea of Saudi Arabia and UAE being these safe, secure places open for investment, foreign investment. MBS has his Vision 2030 that he's trying to push forward. And so if their security is threatened in that way, then they have an incentive to come to the negotiating table and to stick to the truce, because what stops the Houthis from then sending another drone, attack to these areas? And it's just been so deeply unpopular. Here in the US, there's been mounting, pressure on the Biden administration. There's talk of war powers again. One, like we said, was passed successfully as well. And so all of the signals to the Saudis that Biden is under a lot of pressure to not support them. He continued, of course, to support them, but he's under a lot of pressure not to support them. The war in Ukraine is happening, and it's, pulling resources elsewhere and attention elsewhere. And it's already such an unpopular war. And now the Houthis, for the very first time, are able to strike back in a way that affects the Saudis. And so I think that's an incentive for them, at least, to abide by the truce. But I'll let Shuaib add to this.
Yeah, can you please repeat the question again?
Sure. So my question was, there have been prior ceasefire attempts, but on those occasions, the ceasefires they broke down. So at this point, what is motivating or incentivizing the parties to abide by this ceasefire? Like, what makes this truce any different?
Yes. Yeah, there was a ceasefire in March 2020, 2021, and the Houthis rejected it, although it is almost identical to this recent one. But what it changed here is the Houthi have retaliated and hit Abu Dhabi and Jeddah, and then said we can stop now. So far, we have retaliated and took revenge. We can all stop and then see what happened next. Another thing was the Houthi was not successful in taking Marib, and that made them accept the ceasefire now, because the reason why Saudi Arabia proposed a ceasefire in 2021 was that the return for the ceasefire was for the Houthi to stop their offensive against Marib, and the Houthi didn't honor the proposal, and then said we'll continue till we liberate all.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. So it seems like the stakes are a little bit higher now for Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Dr. Sheline, what do you think motivated?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I have a short outage here in.
That's okay. That's okay.
Yes. Now, okay. Now, what convinced Saudi Arabia?
It seems like your Wi-Fi is going in and out.
Yeah, I must say that the strike, the Saudi Emirati strike on Hodeidah last month in February, that destroyed most of the infrastructure that connects Yemen to the world through the internet, has affected a lot of Yemenis, millions of Yemenis' ability to connect to the rest of the world, and I hope this sort of ability for Yemenis to connect to the world is not only restored but also improved. And I think the onus here is not only on the Saudis but every country that supported them, including those who made those bombs or made those planes that made Saudi take out Yemeni internet infrastructure. And it's unfortunate that none of those people who talk today about war crime in Ukraine have said anything about this strike on civilian infrastructure that was providing internet and life-saving connections. So I think there is a question by Mr. Pearson. So I think one of our doctors, I think, is best equipped to answer it. It says, was the UAE still taking part in the airstrikes on Yemen before the truce? Was it only Saudi Arabia, or was it only Saudi Arabia?
I'm happy to weigh in there. Sorry, dog. So essentially, we had seen the UAE had primarily been more involved in terms of its support for militias on the ground. And we had seen the UAE pull most of their own troops out at the end of 2019. This followed this period when the US had passed this War Powers Resolution, which was then vetoed. But there was this sense of, was the war going to wind down at that point? And that's actually when we saw the Saudi-led airstrikes, the Saudi airstrikes reached their lowest point in the entire war was during this period when the UAE said, we're going to withdraw our forces. They continued to hold certain key strategic locations, including the island of Socotra, or they held them sort of through their proxies like the Southern Transitional Council, as well as the island of Mayoun in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, as well as certain key ports and gas facilities. So what changed though more recently, and what's interesting here is we did see this visit by Jake Sullivan, Tim Lenderking, Brett McGurk, so key members of the Biden administration, including the special envoy for Yemen, who traveled to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE this past fall. And our understanding of what happened there was that there was an agreement made that the Biden administration was going to offer this additional support to the Saudi-led coalition to kind of give them this final push to try to grant Saudi Arabia the opportunity to withdraw with some measure of dignity, because that's been the Saudi position that, we want to end the war, but not like this. We don't want to go home with our tail between our legs. And so what we ended up seeing was this spike in air raids and also this push from the UAE supporting, for example, the Giants Brigades, which are a UAE-backed Yemeni militia group that did successfully retake territory in the provinces of Al-Baida and Shabwa and parts of the Ma'arib province that the Houthis had taken relatively recently, so these forces took those back. And this is part of what then prompted the Houthis to, for the first time, relaunch attacks against the UAE, because the Houthis had ended their attacks on the UAE after they had really reduced their military involvement. So again, for the most part, the actual planes flying over Yemen are part of the Saudi Air Force, and more of what the UAE is doing is providing funding and support and weapons to these militias on the ground.
And if I can add, I would argue that in a way then the UAE's role has been much more kind of nefarious and imperialistic. The Saudis have caused a lot of damage by airstrikes, but it looks like they had no future agenda. We're just going to bomb. We're going to blockade. We're going to use aid as a weapon, and maybe the Houthis will surrender. Whereas the UAE is very strategic with how they use their resources. So when they saw that it's really costly for them to have troops on the ground, they pulled them out. They got this amazing PR campaign in late 2019 that the UAE pulled out, but really they just put most of their resources into militias on the ground. So all of the different people, all of the different factions fighting the Houthis on the ground are foreign backed. They're either backed by the UAE or they're backed by the Saudis. And those are the people who are on this war council, what I'm calling the war council right now, whether in Shabwa or Ma'rib or in Hodeidah. And so all of them have been funded by the UAE or the Saudi Arabians over the last 7 years. And the UAE has all but annexed the island of Socotra. Their occupation of the island on Bab el-Mandeb Strait, as Annelle mentioned, Bab el-Mandeb Strait is in a really important strategic chokehold where 6.2 million barrels of oil and oil products travel per day to Europe and to Asia. And so for them to place themselves there in that location where China has a base on the other side in Djibouti is hugely important as a strategic kind of outlook. And then, of course, there's been the operation of secret prisons, assassination campaigns. All of them are well documented, and all of these have been financed and led by the UAE.
Thank you, Dr. Shireen. I actually have another question for you. Do you think that the formation of the Leadership Council will affect the truce? Can you explain a little bit of how, the War Council being backed by the UAE and Saudi Arabia will affect the truce?
I think, as Ali mentioned earlier, if this were a council that was a result of negotiations that were happening in Oman, then we could have a more positive outlook. But it feels like, basically what happened as negotiations were happening and this truce was agreed upon, then this council was kind of assembled at the last minute away from the negotiators in Saudi Arabia. Hadi's basically told, okay, now you're no longer president, and he makes this announcement. And so it's this bad faith effort to, there's not been a political negotiation that brought about this council. It's just another appointment. And so now you don't have Hadi anymore, but you have all of these 8 people on this council. Some of them have loyalties to the UAE. Some of them have loyalties to Saudi Arabia. None of them have loyalties to the Yemeni people because they've been, funded by these foreign governments for the last several years. And so I worry that, what does this mean for the truce? These aren't the people who are negotiating the truce. And so what'll happen then? I mean, how are you going to even get them all in one room without fighting one another? But then how are you going to get them in a room and have a good faith effort to talk through with, everybody involved, including the Houthis? I worry about that.
There is another question from Mr. Friedman here. Why did, I think Dr. Shireen, and maybe Shuaib, sorry. I always say Shuaib for some reason. Why did the Houthis not respond when the Biden administration took them off the terrorist list?
I'm not sure if Shuaib is trying to respond to that. Shuaib, we can't hear you.
Yeah. Respond with what? To remove Biden from their terror list? They don't have anything to do in return. I mean, it's for them it's meaningless, although it's it has some value, but in reality it doesn't have much on the ground, on the battlefronts, and the Houthi wanted to lift the blockade, and they would honor the any kind of ceasefire with in kind. That's what they have demanded for since the war began. Stop the war, we will stop our fighting. Other than that, we will not cave in. I think Shireen and Anne will have more on this.
Yeah, I would. I think that's a really important perspective, and I would add that maybe the question should be, why would Biden? Why were they put on that list to begin with? And the answer is, it was a political move by the Trump administration. It's a complete misuse of the FTO, foreign terrorist list. And it was used as a last-ditch effort, which the UAE was pushing forth really strongly, as a last-ditch kind of attempt from the Trump administration to get the Houthis to surrender. Because again, they were just throwing everything at the Yemeni civilians, right? Whether it's airstrikes or blockade or hitting agricultural lands or hitting our water resources or using aid as a weapon, and then, designating the Houthis, it means all of us living abroad wouldn't be able to send money back home. And remittances are a large part of Yemeni economy. It means that, aid organizations wouldn't be able to operate in areas that are controlled by the Houthis. Again, most of the population lives there, and so it would cause mass starvation. But I don't think the Houthis it was just used as a political move anyway. And Biden, in his first acts of office, one of his first acts, removed them from the list, only a year later to go back and to threaten putting them back on the list, which I think also shows the Biden administration's kind of deception when it comes to what they promised and what they ended up doing in Yemen over the past year.
So we have more questions, Lama.
Yes, we do have more questions. So someone is asking, and I think Dr. Annelle, you can take this, what the role of Iran is in these changes and in the truce?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, this notion that this is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia is really flawed. I mean, the conflict had begun in Yemen prior to foreign involvement. Furthermore, when the Saudis did decide to invade in 2015, we know it was because of their fear that Iran was supporting the Houthis, but at the time, Iranian involvement was really quite minimal. What's ironic is that in the intervening 7 years, the Iranians have provided a lot more support, and so everything the Saudis are doing has made everything worse from their perspective. But in general, it's the Houthis operate, they have their own agenda here. They're not sort of something that came about as a result of Iran's support. And so, although Iran has assisted them in being able to smuggle in weapons, etc., it's really quite minimal compared to the vast amounts of resources and weaponry that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been expending, either directly themselves bombing or providing for these militias on the ground. So unfortunately, I think there's sort of this perception that perhaps if Iran and the US rejoined the Iran nuclear deal, that then perhaps the US could use that as a starting off point for further negotiations to convince Iran to stop supporting the Houthis. And that could happen. But even if Iran withdrew even the support that they do provide, it's unlikely that would really necessarily impact the Houthis' own agenda on the ground, which has been that they want to take control. And thus far, unfortunately, what their experience has been is that they're better able to do that on the battlefield, and they have very few incentives to negotiate. The hope now is perhaps if they do see that the Saudis maintain their side of the agreement by allowing in fuel ships, by allowing planes to come into Sana'a airport, perhaps this will help provide some confidence that negotiations are worthwhile, and perhaps we could see the Houthis sort of members within the Houthi organization who would be more open to that their voices would be able to predominate here. But again, as Dr. Al-Adeimi has said, the concern is that this new Presidential Leadership Council is really just intended as a war council. And I think the Houthis themselves may be aware of that. But so just back to the role of Iran here, I don't see them as really being able to have that much of an impact.
And to add, they have not been part of the negotiations. Again, this, fiction that we've been fed that this is a proxy war, that Iran is a major player in this war. Where are they in the negotiating table? Nowhere to be found, because they are not part of this war. And I have to remind folks that the country is under land, air, and sea blockade. And so Iran's role has been hugely overstated. Not by Annelle or anything I meant like overstated in general, but like Annelle said, it's very minimal to begin with. And if anything, it pushed the Houthis closer to Iran.
Thanks. So we have a couple questions about the end of the war, like what steps have to be taken in order to end the war. And someone also asked, do you believe that a post-war power-sharing agreement, even if it includes a diverse set of Yemeni voices, will be an effective political solution to the conflict? Dr. Shireen, I think you should take this.
I'm sure I can start. I want to remind folks that in March of 2015, 2 days before the Saudi Arabians started bombing Yemen, an agreement was on the table and Yemeni parties were ready to sign it. This is after the Houthi takeover of Sana'a. This is after they put Hadi on house arrest and he resigned and then took back his resignation and went to Aden and cried, for support from the Saudis. After all of that, they were still able to sit down with the UN envoy at the time, Jamal bin Umar, and this is coming straight from Jamal bin Umar's writing. He writes about this, and he talks about, a negotiated deal, basically, that covered the executive and the legislature that was ready to be signed. And he was talking to the Saudis at the time because they were interested in having the agreement signed in Riyadh. And to his surprise, 2 days later, they started bombing. So clearly the Saudis saw this. They didn't like that there was going to be this agreement, power sharing agreement. They didn't want the Houthis part of this calculus at all, and decided to use war instead of politics and to really intervene in Yemeni conflict, internal conflict at the time. But I do think that that is the only way out. Yemenis have to live with one another. There is a diverse set of perspectives and a diverse set of beliefs and values and, allegiances. But they are the ones who are most invested in having a peaceful Yemen. And so they will have to work themselves out. Clearly, separatist groups are taken seriously enough for the leader of the separatist group to be on this council. And so maybe Yemen won't look the same, and maybe we go back to North and South like we did before 1990. I don't know. But whatever they decide, I think they're more than capable of deciding for their own selves. And this has been kind of the call for all of us here living in countries that have supported this war with weapons, with intelligence sharing, with especially the US, with logistics, with spare parts, with maintenance, with training, and of course with weapons. The call has always been to end all of this support, not because it's going to end the war in Yemen, but it would allow Yemenis to deal with their own future.
To add on to that, what role should the United Nations Security Council play in ending the conflict, if any? Do you have an answer to that? Dr. Shireen, if you want to start, and then, I'm sorry, I was muted. And then Dr. Annelle, if you want to finish that question off.
Yeah, I think one of the most disappointing things is that no UNSC resolution, UN Security Council resolution has been proposed. And so we have UNSC 2216, which was written by the Saudis, essentially. They thought the Russians might veto it. They didn't. And so it was allowed to pass. And it essentially allows Saudi Arabia to, it legitimizes their attack in Yemen. And it was the precursor to the blockade because it allowed the Saudis to monitor all of the ships coming in and out of Yemen, or coming out into Yemen. But there's been no new UN Security Council resolution that has been proposed, and so I would hope that's what should have that's what should have happened instead of this appointment of the Presidential Council. The UN should have taken a greater role to see it through. Okay, they played a part in the negotiating the truce. They should have seen this through and introduced a new Security Council that all parties would agree to.
To add on there, one interesting thing that we have now heard from the head of the 8-member Presidential Leadership Council is he says things like, we're here to negotiate, we're pushing for peace, but then he reasserts that the terms under which they're operating are things like UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which again, it is in itself no longer in effect because part of that Security Council resolution was to reinstate Hadi, and now he's not the president anymore. And so they're sort of continuing to use this framework, which again, back in 2015, there was this idea that the Saudis would intervene, would lead this coalition, and that we could get Yemen back on this political transition that had begun after the Arab Spring. And at the time, and still now there are many in Yemen who would I think like to return to that, who are fearful of a future where Yemen is dominated by the Houthis. But unfortunately, in the interim, it's just not realistic anymore. And because this war has dragged on for so long and continued to empower those that have weapons, the outcome we're likely to see is going to be one that is the result of this kind of firepower. And so again, this notion that we could go back to the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference, for example, which is part of what Al-Adeimi has said, it just unfortunately is not very realistic. But I think part of why we're seeing that is there remains this veneer of legitimacy attached to that, when the reality on the ground has just been this absolute devastation. And I think for many people, they're just desperate for the violence to stop and this ultimate question of the political future can only be addressed once people have enough food and they're no longer being actively bombed. Just one note, I responded in the chat. Unfortunately, I can't bring up the image itself, but this question about saying that the Iranians are providing missiles to the Houthis, and they are, but when you look at actually the scale of what the Saudis are doing to Yemen, it is hundreds of air raids a day. Whereas when you look at what the Houthis, for example, are able to lob across the border at Saudi Arabia, it's this tiny little line at the bottom, and 90% of that are blocked with U.S. assistance. Ned Price, the spokesperson for the State Department, reaffirmed this recently. So again, as we pointed out, it really only takes kind of one drone attack on Abu Dhabi and one high-profile attack on Jeddah, for example, and suddenly we see a shift in Saudi and Emirati behavior. Which is encouraging, but there's been this narrative, like also from the Biden administration, that we have to help support the Saudis, that they're dealing with all these attacks from the Houthis are the aggressors. When you look at the scale, that narrative just completely falls apart.
Thank you.
I have to say that if you look at the civilian death on the Saudi side, it's basically non-existent. Not, compare that to the Yemeni. So, just in terms of children, at least, you will see like a huge difference. So, to me, this is very insulting because, as an Arab person, when people, no matter where are they from, when they discount the lives of Arab people anywhere, that's insulting to me. So, and this is what people talk about denial. You deny these people existed. Also, in terms of in the media in general, they talk about at least part of the Yemeni people as basically as robot, controlled by people in Tehran. That's not the case. The fact that they receive support from the Iranians, it's not a secret, but you have to take it in context of the other side too, and how much support that they get and involvement, and maybe also talking about sort of the sectarian imposition here, because a lot of this was also portrayed as a sectarian conflict. And it's not. So it's really important when you talk about this issue, you kind of take the whole thing into perspective. In 2009, when the first conflict between what people call Houthis and Saudi Arabia happened, and it was because they were accused of receiving Iranians, and they are Iranian, agents and so on. And at the time, they had received zero Iranian assistance. But because they have been accused of it, at the time, I think they got $5 million from Gaddafi. Somebody got it from Libya at the time. And then because they have been accused of it, they said, hey, why not? We're already being touted as guilty. So, and I always, in some conversation I have with some people in the administration, when they talk about it, I says, everybody will do that. You did it during World War II when you allied yourself with Stalin. You were a nuclear power. You're a country. You have, and Europe was on your side. Yet you went to Stalin. So if you want to sort of mention it as a fact is one thing, but to make it as a pretext to support the Saudis is another thing. It's, to say, oh, we are just doing a moral thing. It's not. And I think, to close, I say the U.S. position here is best, not only in ending its 7+ years of direct support, and what Dr. Annelle said, there is more than that of support from the United States. If the U.S. takes that role of sort of war aider to peacemaker it will be much to the interest of the United States. Its respect, its popularity, and its ability to influence things in the region, if it plays a role of a peacemaker that will, for example, that will organize a reparation fund for the Yemeni people, that will collect from those people who bombed Yemen and armed all the manufacturers of bombs should pay these, the average Yemeni people, not the state, not the political sides, but to build hospitals and schools that have been destroyed. You're talking about 11,000 schools in Yemen that many of them have been destroyed, hundreds of hospitals and clinics and so on, and civilian infrastructures. So I think that is sort of, I think, what the U.S. policy should focus on, and it will get a lot of respect for that. Thank you.
Dr. Annelle, I have a question for you. How likely is it that the War Powers Resolution will pass? And if it does, how do you foresee it affecting the U.S.-Saudi bilateral relationship? Do you think MBS will take well to the resolution passing?
Well, it's really hard to know. I do think that, unfortunately, when it did pass in 2019, we saw this, so Jamal Khashoggi was murdered in October of 2018, and then after that, we did see the U.S. ending mid-air refueling and sort of acknowledging that that was not acceptable, but that the other forms of support the U.S. was providing evidently were still acceptable. And so there was that groundswell, as well as kind of the midterms at the end of 2018 also brought in new, especially progressives to Congress. So there was just this overall frustration, even among some Republicans, for Trump's just bear hug of the Saudis and unwillingness to hold MBS accountable for Yemen or Khashoggi or anything. And so there was just a lot of momentum there. I do worry that part of the difference now is that it will require Democrats to push against Biden. And in general, I would have thought that perhaps there might have been more Republicans who would go against Biden. But I think in general, we tend to see the Republicans being more hawkish and tending to support Saudi Arabia, unless it starts to hurt American oil producers. So I do worry that the conditions are different now. At the same time, I think there has been a little bit more awareness of what's been going on. And although obviously the war in Ukraine is very much dominating headlines, I have seen a little bit more of a recognition that, look, if, as an American, you may be feeling very frustrated about what Russia is doing to Ukraine, there's not necessarily a whole lot that you as an individual can do about that. But if you care about an aggressive state going after civilians in a poor and smaller nearby country, there is something you can do. You can try to get Congress to pass this War Powers Resolution. So at least that I think has been, and especially sort of people's awareness of sort of the disparity in coverage of the war in Ukraine, as opposed to obviously the multiple wars that have been ravaging the Middle East in Libya and Syria and Iraq and Yemen. And I believe that there's a little bit more awareness of that. In terms of the impact on the U.S.-Saudi relationship, we're already seeing this relationship under a lot of strain, and a lot of this does have to do with the Saudis being fairly explicit about the fact that they're not going to raise oil production. In many ways, it's not surprising that they wouldn't go against OPEC Plus here. I don't think this is just motivated by MBS trying to sort of piss off Biden, but just the way they've gone about it shows that they really don't think that they will necessarily suffer consequences here, or that they think that the U.S. is going to be forced to continue to provide them ongoing defense assistance. For example, the US did send additional Patriot anti-missile systems to Saudi Arabia, even in the midst of these sort of tensions. So I do think it could really impact the US-Saudi relationship, and I think it's high time for that to happen.
Thank you so much. Shuaib, I have a question for you. What role do you expect Marib, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, to play in the negotiations between the Council and the Houthis? Do you have any input on that?
As long as the ceasefire is ongoing, there won't be any move towards Marib. If anything changes in the coming days or maybe month, yeah, that may push, that may make the Houthi do another offensive against Marib. And if Marib is taken, that would be a big achievement for them. And well, I think the other provinces to the south will fall as well, like Shabwa and Hadramaut, and it will. But the Saudi won't let Marib alone. They will fight. They will put their whole weight against whoever would fight in Marib to prevent its fall. Marib represents the last stronghold for the Saudi Arabia in the north of Yemen, and Saudi Arabia has suffered a lot for the past 7 years, and because for decades Saudi has assumed a king making rule in Yemen, and using the tribes and using a patronage system of payoff to powerful leaders and sheikhs, and that's how it continued to maintain a presence and influence in Yemen through the past 40 years. Now, for the last 7 years, it lost all that, and now what remains, and if it's taken, that would be a big problem for Saudi Arabia.
Great, thank you. I actually have another question for you, Shuaib. What role can the Yemeni diaspora play in resolving this conflict? How should a future government integrate these groups into a future Yemen?
You mean the workers in Saudi Arabia?
I think this person, and Ethan Werner, if you want to explain your question a little better, but I think they mean like immigrants or
immigrants should look for after their work, because that would cause a big problem for them. I mean, I'm talking about Yemeni people in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states in general, or maybe in the United States. There are a lot of Yemenis there. For the United States, they can call their representatives and to do whatever they can to enforce a ceasefire in Yemen, to press their congressmen to end the crisis in Yemen, because it's not in the interest of the United States for the war to keep going on endlessly, and it has caused a lot of death, and Yemenis have suffered a lot, and in the end it would be catastrophic, not only for Yemen but for the entire world. The Houthis, anyone would be mistaken if they think the Houthis will be defeated. That's wrong. The Houthi will not be defeated or cave in. If the ceasefire falls, and I hope it's not, they will cause a huge disruption, not to the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, but to the entire shipping traffic in the Red Sea. There will be a big disaster there. I hope all pay attention to what has been going on in Yemen, and the huge toll on the Yemeni population, and if things is not going to be resolved soon, another disaster like what we have seen in the past 7 years will take place sometime soon.
Thank you so much, Shuaib. Ali, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I wanted to add that the fact that we have, I think, a problem here, because the problem is that perception is that, you know, Houthis are like 1% and they are not popular and they are only able to do this because Iran tells them to do it. That's absolutely wrong. It's not the fact. You have an organic movement that has support within Yemen, and that has to be accepted. You love them, you hate them. That's the reality of life, and I have seen this pattern in the region where the U.S. and its allies think that, oh, these people are, you know, they're just, you know, small group. They have no, and then we're able to kind of use the hammer on them and they will go away. That's not the case. The conflict with these groups have made them more powerful. Look, 2009 at Yemen and Ansarullah, people call them Houthis, and now they have not gotten weaker. They have gotten much stronger, and in many ways, because of this conflict. The same thing with Hamas, with Hezbollah and other groups like that. If it's like you are creating your own enemy. I don't know if this is on purpose or just natural. In terms, because I saw one of the questions thinking that, oh, if Iran was not helping them, they would not be able to withstand this. In 2009, they didn't get any Iranian help, but they were not able only to withstand. They had 6 wars with Ali Abdullah Saleh, where they kind of really won it. And then they had a war with the Saudis, where the Saudis started it, and they were able to capture Saudi territory and kill a lot of Saudi soldiers and basically win this. So it's because they actually have support within that community, at least within certain Yemen. And I wrote a paper in 2010 before the Arab Spring. It's on our website. It's basically, it was a suggestion for the US. It is almost like I had and not a vision, but I was looking at at Yemen, and I saw maybe we should write about Yemen, and saw that things are changing in Yemen. And the U.S. does not have to support dictators for 30 years. You know, they can have them changed every couple of years. You know, there's not only one dictator that you can support; you can change them. And what happened in Yemen, the U.S. and the region, Saudi Arabia, supported Ali Abdullah Saleh for 35 years. Like Hosni Mubarak and others. And what that happened is it created greater opposition to that person. And the paper concluded that the US must, kind of get rid of this dictator, with negotiation, not by bombing or whatever, but in terms of getting a government that represent the people of Yemen. Because you have a new trend in Yemen. Yemen that was basically tribal and allegiances, the young educated men and women, they are not going that way. They are moving toward sort of more following an ideology, an idea, rather than their tribal allegiances. So this is the time, and this is how the Ansarullah, the Houthis, were able to gather a lot of people because they were an outsider. They were anti-government, and they, by and large, they are maybe, at least in rhetoric, they are the most nationalistic of all the other political players in Yemen, and that's at least we can see this because they have not had their organization formed in Iran. They formed from within Yemen. And they say that if Iran wants to impose anything on us, we will refuse it. The others who either pro-Saudis or Saudi-backed or UAE-backed have not been able even to say this. So I think we need to have a really a reimagination of our narrative, our thinking toward not only Yemen but the region and the components within these societies. So I agree with Shuaib that without sort of agreeing and accepting the realities on the ground, this war will continue, and trying to have foreigners intervene and reshape and decide the Yemeni future is not going to end well. Thank you.
I have a question for either Ali or Dr. Shireen. So Ali, you just said that with foreign intervention, the war will continue. Do you foresee, and Dr. Shireen, you can also answer this, do you foresee the peace process, progressing without any foreign intervention? As you said, there's a lot of different perspectives and ideologies between Yemenis. So is that peace process, will it be effective if it just includes Yemenis and no foreign intervention kind of supporting that process?
I mean, it hinges on no foreign intervention. The peace process absolutely hinges on that. The Houthis, and we talk about them being supported by Iran, but they're not seen as within Yemen as being backed by any foreigners, the way that the STC is clearly backed by the UAE, and the Tariq Saleh is clearly backed by the UAE, and there are groups that are clearly backed by the Saudi Arabians. The Houthis, among their supporters, they're not seen as backed by any party. And by the way, like, not every the missile that they send is foreign. The first 2.5 years of the war, it wasn't just the Houthis and Ansarullah fighting. It was them partnering up with their former enemy, Saleh, who had been funded for 30 odd years, like you mentioned, Ali, by the United States, and had a stockpile of weapons. In the first 48 hours of the war, the Saudi Air Force destroyed the Yemeni Air Force, but there were still all of these stockpiles of missiles that the Houthis have been sending, and can see clearly in the graph that Annelle shared that they're far and few between, not even like reaching 50 on that graph throughout the 7 years, right? And so, compared to what the highest point over 900 by the Saudis. And so I would say that it absolutely hinges on no foreign intervention. And without foreign intervention, then what legitimacy does somebody who has been warring on the side of a foreigner would have in Yemen? I think that's up to the Yemeni people to decide. And we have to remember that the mechanisms are there for Yemenis to chart their own course. They're surrounded by countries, Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait are all monarchies. Yemen is the only country in that region that's not a monarchy. It's a republic. And all of this started because people were sick and tired of living under a dictator. They have a democratic system in place that has not been allowed to flourish because of, Saleh, and then post-Saleh Hadi, who are strong allies and almost puppets to the West in a way. I mean, Hadi's definitely been a puppet to Saudi Arabia, but Saleh was definitely like a strong man who was supported by the West and Saudi Arabia for many years. And so I think the quest for democracy is certainly there, and the mechanisms for Yemenis to actually determine their own future are there in that country more than any of their neighbors who are supposedly trying to impose, democracy or legitimacy onto them.
Thank you so much. And Shireen, do you mind answering these two questions from Ethan Weirner? So he asked if you anticipate Hadi playing an active role in Yemeni politics moving forward. And to add to that, do you anticipate Tariq Saleh becoming a major political player in post-war Yemen?
I mean, I'm smiling because I think maybe the one thing all Yemenis agree on is that who's Hadi, and clearly the Saudis have finally caught on that he is just completely useless and had no legitimacy in Yemen, north or south. This guy has been placed in a Saudi hotel for the past 7 years, even though he supposedly controls all of South Yemen. And so he used to make official visits and would stay offshore basically for his life to be protected, because even in areas that he controls, he had no power, no legitimacy, none whatsoever. And now he's gone, and we all can breathe a sigh of relief that we don't have to contend with him anymore. And apparently he was told over, in the middle of the night that, hey, you need to resign. But in terms of Tariq was actually fighting alongside the Houthis for the first 2.5 years when Saleh was also fighting alongside the Houthis. And as soon as the Houthis and Saleh kind of turned against one another, with support from the UAE, kind of the UAE seeing Saleh as their man because they know how useless Hadi is, and they thought, oh, maybe we can put all of our eggs in this Saleh basket. And then that didn't work out very well, because by then the Houthis were much too powerful and entrenched in Sana'a, and within 2 days Saleh was dead. And as soon as that happened, Tariq went to the UAE, amassed an army, has been supported by them for the last 4 or 5 years, and has been fighting alongside with UAE support. Now he's on the war council, he's on this presidential council. And so I would say that he is somebody to be contended with, and could be a major political player in post-war Yemen.
Thank you. Looking through the questions, this is also from Ethan Werner. Can Ali Abdullah Saleh, or remnants of his military, be held accountable for crimes against Yemenis at Change Square in Sana'a in 2011? Dr. Shireen, yeah.
So Saleh has unleashed so much destruction onto Yemen, right? And unlike other Arab Spring presidents, so you have Mubarak, you have Libya, Tunisia, all of these countries where they had their Arab Springs and their presidents were deposed, they either landed in prison or they were exiled, or they were killed. Saleh got to resign under a GCC agreement, and one of the conditions of his resignation was that he could remain in Yemen and he wouldn't be charged for any crimes that happened against protesters, where they opened fire against protesters in 2011. And so he got to be the most powerful man in Yemen still, sit in his palace in Sana'a, control major parts of the army, which he, commanded when it was time to work against the Saudis, allowed the Houthis essentially to take over Sana'a with no opposition from his army, and was seen as a hero in the last couple of years of his life, who was now defending against foreign aggression. And so I don't anticipate any charges or anyone being accountable. But if we talk about accountability, the list of accountability is large. And one of the reasons we saw also an uptick in airstrikes in October, November, December of 2021, we talked about, why did this happen despite Biden's presidency? Well, the UN stopped funding the group of eminent experts who were the independent investigators, a group set up as an independent investigators into all war crimes, all parties in Yemen who were committing these atrocities against civilians. And because of threats and pressures and commands really from the Saudis, the UN stopped funding that group. And as soon as they stopped funding them and allowed the Saudis to officially investigate their own crimes in Yemen, we saw an uptick in airstrikes. So I think if we're talking about accountability, everybody who has had a role in killing civilians, including all of these foreign governments, like my own government here in the US, is deeply complicit in war crimes in Yemen.
I want to add something to what Shireen said, or maybe answer the part of the questions about who killed those in the public square or Change Square. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah, those killers who murdered some 80, 48, 50, I don't know. They were taken to the 1st Armored Division, which then was led by General Ali Mohsen Al-Ahmed, the vice president until the past couple of days. So go ask him, and you can find an answer with Ali Mohsen. Saleh has committed a lot of crimes, but for the Change Square, I'm really skeptical about claims that Saleh was the one who did it. That's it.
And I also want to say, I think he brings up a really important point about the role of the Islah and Ali Mohsen. They stole the People's Revolution. What started off in 2011, on January 2011, as a peaceful protest against Saleh and his government was, taken over by the Islah and Ali Mohsen and his folks, turned into an arms, and they were part of the government that people were protesting against, by the way, but they saw this opportunity and turned against Saleh and have caused so much bloodshed and, arguably are the direct cause of so much of what's happening now.
Yes, I agree in that.
So on the topic of accountability, does anyone think that reparations are due to Yemeni citizens? Like, is the United States responsible, or Saudi Arabia, are they responsible for reconstructing Yemen and rebuilding, everything that was destroyed? Dr. Shireen, do you want to take that question?
I mean, absolutely. How do you put a dollar sign on somebody's life, right? You can't. How do you put a dollar sign on people's, homes and their future and their past and their kids and their livelihoods and their, sources of food and sources of water and hospitals, and how many people have died? And those aren't counted as casualties of war, but how many people died because there's no Tylenol in the shelves for a child with fever, or all of these people who have caused the destruction of Yemen owe Yemen reparations. This is not about charity. This is absolutely about trying to, amend in one way or another the destruction and the loss of life, and turning them back 100 years in terms of their economy, in terms of health outcomes and all of that. So I think absolutely here in the United States, where this war really couldn't have happened, couldn't have been sustained for this long without U.S. intervention, without U.S. training, advising, intelligence sharing, weapons. I think we owe a huge debt to Yemeni society. So do the Emiratis and the Saudis, of course.
For sure. I definitely agree with that. So I have another question for Dr. Annelle. When we look at previous presidential councils in Yemen, it seems like they lacked clear criteria for success. So in your opinion, what would be your ingredients for success in the new or future presidential councils?
Well, I'm not sure if sort of the lack of clear criteria is the issue here. In general, I do worry that this new presidential council is, as Dr. Shireen has mentioned, really just a war council to try to unify the anti-Houthi opposition and to try to force them back from the territory that they've been holding. But as Shuaib said, that is unlikely. Like even if they were successful in pushing the Houthis back, if they were, which is unlikely, but if they were able to really kind of retake much of the territory and maybe sort of force the Houthis back to Saada, we would likely see kind of the Houthis act as a spoiler, kind of similar to what we had seen during the 6 years, or the 6 wars that the Houthis fought against Ali Abdullah Saleh. And this is part of why the Houthis ultimately rejected the outcome of the National Dialogue Conference, because the solution proposed was this federal system for Yemen, and they feared they were just going to be shunted off to the Saada province, which has very few natural resources, and that it wouldn't address some of their fundamental concerns about the fact that Ali Abdullah Saleh's rule had consolidated all resources in Sana'a. And the hope was that in the future, a federated system would allow at least for a better distribution of resources and more autonomy for Yemen, but certain regions were going to be sort of cut out of that. So again, I just sort of question that this is a good faith effort here by the Saudis to sort of put forward a presidential leadership council that is actually supposed to achieve some sort of political future for Yemen. That's not, again, as has been mentioned, everyone on this council has either a military background or they're very very much in bed, and they are very much in bed with the Saudis and Emiratis. So I guess I just don't really have a whole lot of faith here. But again, I do think that the reason there may be a cause for optimism would come from pressure from the United States that if the US makes it clear, especially US Congress makes it clear that Saudi Arabia, you're going to lose the ability to fly your own planes over Yemen, and that's going to be quite humiliating for you. So you really need to push your proxies on the ground here to figure this out at the negotiating table. I think that is a crucial role for the US to play here. And otherwise, if we don't see the US applying that pressure, I do anticipate that this will just be sort of a reconfiguration in preparation for additional violence.
May I jump here?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, the council, the World Council, as Shireen called it, it's nothing new. I mean, it's as someone said, it's old wine in new bottles. It wouldn't make a big difference in the battlefronts. We know all these people. They're the reason why I think they were announced, the council was announced as for Saudi Arabia to evade responsibility for the 7 years failure in Yemen, and just come up with this council to say, hey, this one will lead you into the right position, into victory against Houthi. It will not succeed if the Saudi Arabia does not commit to a ceasefire. It would need to convince America to intervene directly. Otherwise, it will lose a lot in Yemen.
For sure. Thank you
That's
so
it.
much. Thank you. So, Shuaib, I actually have another question for you. What do you foresee the Saudi-Yemen relationship looking like after the war?
It would be under a lot of strain. Saudis have killed a lot in Yemen. More than the killing, it has humiliated the Yemenis a lot. And Yemenis will not forget. Maybe they don't have the power now to retaliate, but we wouldn't be making a good relationship with Saudi Arabia for the next century. I think it will. Saudi have caused a huge disruption to Yemeni lives and killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and I don't see any way they can heal the wounds to the Yemeni people. The money alone would not help solve the grievances, and but that doesn't mean they should keep the war on. They should put an end and try to compensate in any way so that they can at least stay safe for the next years. Then hopefully time will heal all our wounds.
Thank you. Ali, do you want to speak a little bit to the US-Yemen relationship post-war?
I think what I want to say is that I think now there's an opportunity to not only to create a new policy between Yemen and the US, but also between sort of these countries that have played major role within Yemen conflict, with Saudi Arabia first and UAE and the Gulf in general, with the United States, and also with Iran that has at least been blamed for some role. It's for the interest of Yemen to have good relationship with all of these countries, and notwithstanding all sort of the involvement in different ways. That's why I think I second what Shuaib said. It's very hard, and as a person from Saudi Arabia, I feel so close to the Yemeni people. These are the people as a child, I interacted with before seeing any other non-locals. They were Yemenis. These are the people who I would jump the school fence to go to the Yemeni shopkeeper who makes us the best egg sandwiches. That's how I feel. I grew up with this. These are my people. I think there should be some set of reparation, not only from the Saudis, but from all those countries, 17 countries, what people call sort of the alliance that has directly or indirectly helped kill and destroy a lot of things in Yemen. Saudi Arabia, I think, should pay, because it helps building schools and hospitals. It makes lives better. It heals those wounds. And also, for example, allowing Yemenis, remove the visa restrictions so Yemenis can go back to Saudi Arabia and make money and send home to build the country faster. Yemenis have built, for example, our house.
Just checking to see if we're still on for 3 o'clock.
I'm sorry?
All right. Kill the fatted calf. I'm on the way in a few minutes.
Sorry, I think there's interference. There need to be good relations, assistance from the Gulf to Yemen by offering them direct help, reconstruction, and also allowing Yemenis to work in the entire Gulf countries without restrictions. I think they should have special. We used to have it. Yemenis did not require to have a visa in the past, and they contributed to the development of the country. And I think that's one of the ways that Saudi Arabia can do it. And understand, I think what the most important is that not only Saudi Arabia, but its backers in Washington and London must understand that Yemenis have to decide their own path. And if you don't like these people, because they happen to be from the Zaydi sect of Islam, too bad. That's your problem. There are Yemenis, and they will play a role in their government. We want them to play a role where they have sort of a national cohesive government instead of just elitist or led by one group. Because I don't want to take much time, but this is my closing statement as well. So I want to hear from Dr. Annelle and Dr. Shireen in terms of the closing statement, because I think we are approaching the end of our time. Thank you.
Okay, so just really quickly in closing, in terms of obviously it would be wonderful if this truce were to hold and the new presidential council really were primarily intended or encouraged to negotiate in good faith with the Houthis, and we could finally end the violence. But as many questions in the chat have brought up, then there's this whole question of, well, what comes after? And this question of reparations, I think obviously are due, but I'm fairly pessimistic about those actually being granted. And knowing that Yemen was already in such dire straits before being completely destroyed by this war in terms of water resources and just the economic background of the country, much of this reflecting the misgovernment of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who stole huge amounts of money from Yemen. So not to make everything so pessimistic, but I do just think it's very important. I've sort of noticed a bit of this notion that, okay, like Yemen's war is over, let's move on. And the point is the war is not over. And even once the war, inshallah, will end, there's still going to be so much work to be done. And the international community, especially the United States and the UK, that have profited immensely from selling these weapons, really do owe Yemen billions of dollars that they gained from these kinds of sales, as well as the Saudis and Emiratis. So the hope moving forward is that Yemen won't be forgotten. And so to the, many thanks to those of us who stuck with us and joined us for this panel and for your efforts to help people not forget about what's happening to Yemen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Annelle. Dr. Shireen, do you have any last words or closing statement?
Sure. I don't know, where do I start, right? Like, yes, there is some optimism, but also we're not naive to the machinations of the Saudi-led coalition. Like we mentioned here, this is just another attempt for them to have the veneer of kind of peacemaking, but it's really just war making through Yemeni faces overtly. And this has been called a civil war for the last 7 years. I refuse to call it a civil war when there's so much foreign backing and intervention. But what I worry about is that assuming foreign intervention is actually going to end and foreign backing is actually going to end, then I do see a potential for a civil war over the next, hopefully not too long, and can't be too destructive compared to what Yemen's already been through. But I don't think the future looks great for Yemen as things stand. You can't just bomb a people for 7 years, starve them, dismantle every institution within that country, and then just walk away and say, oh, okay, now sort it out among yourselves, right? And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But for those of us living in the US, I noticed that Charles Pearson had mentioned earlier in the comment, do Congress people still assume that, well, if we don't support the Saudis, then Houthis are going to go to Iran, or Iran is going to be more influential? Of course, they still think that, and they have many more kind of misleading and misinformed views that are shaped by their hawkish kind of lens. When it comes to Yemen, they're shaped by looking at Yemen as a terrorist kind of problem to solve. But we need to continue educating and our Congress people and really demanding that they end all US involvement, still pass a war powers. Whatever is happening in Yemen, we should still pass a war powers to ensure that the US doesn't go back to supporting the Saudis in any way, and really supporting any other conflicts abroad without Congress's approval. And so I hope we continue to push for reparations, push for a real end to foreign intervention, and wait and see what Yemenis have to deal with on their own. My people are more than capable of solving their own problems. And we're a civilization that lasted for thousands of years and will last for thousands more. And so I feel nothing but pride and admiration for the average Yemeni on the ground, who's including, Shuaib, who's joining us from Yemen, who have endured and who have held their head up high and who have been an example to all of us here abroad. And I hope, humanity for everything that they've endured. So I'll end with that.
Thank you so much. And just another thank you to all of our speakers and the audience for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And I think we had a really great and productive conversation today. And the Institute for Gulf Affairs will be having more events on Yemen, so everybody look out for that. We hope to see you all there. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.